Welcome, one and all, to the AFL Coast to Coast podcast. It is episode 13. We are going to be talking about round 10, Sir Doug Nicholls round of the AFL, and we're going to be going through a fair amount of matches. I've taken a pretty comprehensive amount of notes, so I hope you enjoy that. We'll go through Geelong versus Gold Coast, Sydney versus Carlton, Collingwood and Adelaide, Port and Hawthorn, and finishing off with the West Coast Eagles versus Melbourne. And we'll be covering the other games, talking about the injuries and suspensions, and as always, going through the round ahead. Before we really get into it, I just want to take a second to talk about a few things. A couple of errors, first of all, that I made on last week's podcast. First of all, it wasn't actually episode 11. Last week's was episode 12. And for some reason, I'm not too sure why, but I thought Essendon made the finals last year. So obviously, when I was doing my Essendon write-up, basically the points stand, but they're instead of them being statistically bad and making the finals, they were just in the mix. But yeah, unfortunately, I think I mixed them a bit up with St Kilda in my head when I was doing the preseason write-up, and that factoid has just implanted itself into my brain. So apologies for that. And the final thing I want to touch on, it's not an error or anything, it's just a few of my sources, because as you know, did the write-up mostly by myself this week, and I watched most of the longer write-ups. I did watch the games myself, but a lot of the deep statistics that I look at after the game, that I heavily rely on for this podcast, I want to give a bit more direct credit for, because especially in these last two episodes, we probably wouldn't have had the podcast for them. So to start it all off, I'm just going to mention him again. Emlyn Breese, also known as Credit to Du Bois. You can find him on Twitter. He makes brilliant attacking charts. Really good for seeing the flow of play, scoring from intercepts, scoring from stoppages, and possession charts. Really great little condensed guide, so check him out if you want to have a look at that yourself. Another one is Richard Little on X, A Little Fitness. All these links will be in the description. He does a lot of chains. So whenever I'm talking about a team having short chains from the back half, or a lot of non-conversion in the forward half, probably referring to stuff that I've gotten from his charts. So again, shout out to that. And the final one, Andrew Whelan, at Andrew Whelan on Twitter, and he also has a brilliant site called Wheelo Rating, and well, the name is his name, Andrew Whelan, mixed with ELO ratings, and that's where I find a lot of my how teams are doing in certain statistics, whether they're top, bottom, how they compare to league averages, and it's great. It's color coded. You can get stuff at a glance. You can deep dive into it. So again, recommend checking that out if you're just not understanding a few teams and how they're going the way they are. So I basically look at all that. I like to watch the games myself and combine it with those ratings, but for some of these, especially this week, I've used it for the games that I couldn't really focus 100% of my attention. So yeah, hopefully it still gives you a really good overview. I hope I'm not directly taking too much from the things, and you can see some of the storytelling, I suppose, with the match recaps. And yeah, that's about sums it up. Not very interesting, but again, it's a good resources if you are so inclined. Without further ado, though, let's jump into the matches. The Suns have made a claim on one of the strongest home team's advantages in sports, as they have melted away Geelong's defence at TIO Stadium and have recorded their highest ever club score and made Geelong suffer their worst score ever under Chris Scott as a head coach. A 5-day turnaround for both Geelong and Gold Coast saw a lot of outs, with both teams not risking some of their older players for the journey. with Witts, Walters, Holman, Rogers all being managed by the Suns, and Hawkins, Stanley, and Duncan being rested alongside Cameron, who was he was concussed, and the late injury to Sam DeConan joined that. In what would set the tone for the game, Conway took a great intercept mark in defence, only to kick the ball too slow, allowing a top of the goal square marking intercept for Gold Coast to open up their account. This goal would be one of 21 scoring shots from interception for the Gold Coast, who recorded 18 intercept marks to 7 in really tough Darwin conditions. The game would be fairly loose early, with both teams scoring accurately and a slew of goals from general play. However, strong hands by Sam Day and Lukosius had the Suns looking threatening on offense, as Geelong relied from turnovers to get a bulk of their early score. Gold Coast would kick 6 goals in a row midway through the second quarter and continue the dominance in the third, winning those two quarters by 69 points. As players got tired, the game just turned into a real free-for-all shootout. The Suns would narrowly lose the quarter, 43 to 45 points, and it would mean that both teams won a half each, but Geelong would ultimately lose the game by a big margin, 26-8, 164 for the Suns to 15-10, 100. Yeah, Geelong did not bring their A-grade tolls to the game, which in the harsh, humid Darwin conditions you would probably consider fair. And, some of those were forced out as well, as we said with Cameron with concussion. The Suns would prove that all height needs is class those to play in those conditions, as tolls Lukosius, Day, Moyle, Anderson, Collins, and Charlie Ballard all had solid contributions to the night, with Lukosius having a ridiculous game of 5 goals, 12 score involvements from 14 possessions, 88% of his touches turned into scores. And Noah Anderson, who recorded 42 possessions, 11 contested at 80% efficiency, 4 tackles, 700 metres gained, 15 score involvements, and 2-1 on his own boot. Rao rounded off the insane work out the middle with 35 possessions, 13 contested, 11 score involvements, 31 pressure acts, which was a night high, and 10 tackles, the first of which made him the fastest ever player to reach 500 tackles in his 72 games, beating hardball Jack Steele, who did it in 74. Suns' overall tackling was impressive, winning the account 71 to 57, but also recording 14 to 6 tackles inside 50. The only player for Geelong that could hold a candle to the Suns in the midfield was Max Holmes, who had 32 possessions, 14 contested, 4 tackles, 7 clearances, 6 intercepts, 22 pressure acts, and kicked 1 goals, 1. Despite the early blunder from Conway, he was actually pretty impressive for the young kid, and must have learned a bit from Blickloves, as he recorded 11 clearances from his 25 hitouts, and could hold his head high for the night. Defence is where Geelong really struggled, and it started in their midfield with the sheer numbers of inside 50s conceded. Both teams would score a stack of goal from chains starting from inside 50 and forward half, but Geelong would let so many more back half chains from the Gold Coast Suns penetrate their forward 50, with their intercept marking game absolutely shut down. These could either be converted as set shots or ground balls won to the Suns' content. Tom Stewart has 0 marks for the game, the first time that's ever happened. But he at least had 13 intercepts, but he couldn't keep the ball away from the small pressure forwards like Ben Long and Bailey Humphries, kicking 2 and 5 goals respectively, whilst providing 7 tackles inside 50 and 17 score involvement. Jack Henry got towed up by King, who scored 4 goals. Kolodajny did limit Day's disposal, but did not limit his influence and didn't really impact the game himself. Guthrie and Atkins provided some solid tackling pressure with 5 each, but not nearly as impressive on the rebound as the Gold Coast halfbacks. Meanwhile, Collins, Sexton, and Ballard shut down most of the tolls for Geelong, with only Ollie Henry recording 2 marks inside 50, He kicked 2 goals but only had 7 disposals, and Shannon Neal was more resourceful for his impressive 2 goals for the young lad, but had little impact elsewhere. Sexton also combined with Flanders and Whelan off halfback, starting a lot of attacking generation from that area for the Suns, with Sexton getting 31 possessions, 10 marks, 10 score involvements, and a massive 837 metres gained. Tyson Stengel for Geelong was an opportunist with his 3 goals, but provided good pressure. But the second Geelong player who can really hold his head night for the night was Brian Myers, who kicked 2 goals, had 31 possessions, 11 contested, 75% efficiency, and 10 score involvements. The next highest for Geelong would be a paltry 6, as he was good up the ground as well as up forward. In a game where a total of 155 scores were scored, off intercept and turnovers, which was roughly even for both teams. Big difference, as mentioned earlier, was the Suns' ability to generate those intercept marks, and as mentioned, their ability to convert those intercepts into good movement from halfback, at a good balance between contested and uncontested play. The Cats were good with their hard and loose ball once the ball hit the deck. But yeah, marking was a pretty big difference between the two teams. A lot was made of the disparity in the free kick count, lopsided early, but ending up being 25-14. However, although I have no bearing on the quality of the umpiring, it only really seemed to affect the passages of play and not the direct score, at least for the Suns, as only free kicks for the night ended up being converted into scoring shots, and 2 of those were actually for the Cats. The Gold Coast accuracy could be attributed to the amount of set straight shots they had. They had 13 direct scoring shots compared to Geelong's 4, with a whopping 16-9 goals in favour of the Suns, coming from shots kicked at an angle of no worse than 30 degrees. Geelong went into the game probably a bit mentally unprepared for the attacking ferocity Gold Coast was able to give them. And while it is tough playing a game in these conditions, when a team is unable to go there early and acclimatise, you see this in other leagues with like the London game in the NFL, where, the team that normally gets there the latest loses. But, it's not the sole reason they lost, and especially not so much convincingly. And the biggest worry for Geelong is their defence. Despite being strong in the start of the year, has now gone back-to-back games conceding 70-point halves, with it happening twice in this game. Their offense has proved to hold its own this year, and it really just needs an average defense or better to stay a top threat. But it's not actually statistically all that good this year. For Gold Coast, this game was massive, as they are similar to Adelaide last year, being able to win those big games at home when needed and rack up some huge scores. The problem for Gold Coast is it has some tougher road trips ahead, so they need a few wins against the top 8 sides if they want to make a sneaky entrance to finals, which would be earlier than expected. And yeah, that pretty much wraps it up. Actually, I have to confess, halfway through reading all this, I completely forgot that I didn't actually watch this game. So this is the one where I got a lot of stats off. But yeah, it was very interesting to see the high level of shooting out in this game. Honestly, if you got me to predict, and I think I mentioned it last week, I thought this game was going to be like a dire, still high turnover, but not much conversion affair, very sloppy. But the fact that these teams did convert all that into a massive shootout, it made it a bit more interesting. I don't like a lot of these games where it's just goal on goal on goal on goal. I do like periods of very good defense. I'm very analytical. I love dissecting it. But yeah, I feel like it was a pretty fun one to watch. Not exciting in terms of contest, but shoot out every once in a while isn't too bad. And I'm a bit upset that I did miss this one, but yeah, hopefully the reporting on it was, satisfactory. And we will head on to the next game, which I did watch. And it saw Sydney face Carlton. It was a very hyped up match. It was very good to see an electric Sydney crowd at this game. And despite Carlton getting off to a fast start on the most rounded team in the competition right now, Sydney would put the clamps on Carlton, who, after kicking the first 5 goals in the first quarter, would only kick 4 more for the rest of the game as Sydney consumed Carlton's midfield and stifled their outside movement. And at the same time, Sydney kept the second best stoppage scoring team to just 13 points from that area as they kicked a whopping 51 points from that stoppage clearances. Despite it being strong in the first quarter, Carlton's ball movement was very lackluster after that, and as they were sorely missing their halfbacks inside and Doherty, a lot's been said about their injuries. And defensively, they also missed Jacob Wiedering, who was subbed off after the first quarter, allowing Hayden McLean to run loose. Meanwhile, Chad Warner was not only showing up Carlton's midfield where he was tearing it up, but also teaching their small forwards a lesson on how to be a threat, as he had a massive game at 28 disposals, 10 contested at 78% efficiency, 4 tackles, 4 intercepts, 14 score involvements, and kicked 3 goals too. He led Sydney to an emphatic 17-15, 117 to 9-11, 65 victory, as Carlton had almost all of their flaws on full display in prime time, as they unfortunately drop out the 8 despite a strong start to the year, and a bit of a hard fixture and injury has really put them in the bog of teams trying to call themselves finals contender, instead of being a bit ahead of the pack, where we sort of had a bit more in the first probably 7 rounds of the year. After the fast start from Carlton, Sydney would produce a wave of one-way traffic, dominating stoppages and possessions, and this would continue for the rest of the game as Carlton would only bring the game back to about even very, very late. As mentioned before, there was a lot of dominant middle-of-the-ground performances, with Heaney, Grundy, Jordan, and Rowbottom joining Water as central pieces to their victory, as 8 goals, 4 of their entire score came from their midfield unit, with Heaney kicking 3 and Jordan and Rowbottom getting a goal each. Rowbottom also recorded an insane 16 tackles and got 6 clearances himself from his 19 possessions, along with a whopping 35 pressure acts, and Heaney got 12 score involvements, 5 clearances, 8 tackles, and 24 possessions at 70%. Despite struggling off halfback, chain starter Nick Newman for Carlton still had a great game with 32 possessions at 87% efficiency. They had 6 intercepts with that, and Mark Pittonet tried his heart out against Grundy, and although he only got 17 hitouts, he had 11 clearances and 15 contested possession, and gave some consistency in the middle, in the centre, even when Carlton were getting flogged in the clearances. Despite missing Wiedering, the other Carlton tall defenders in Boyd, Kemp and Marchbank did an okay job at restricting their men and got 15 intercept possessions, but they gave away a few nervous free kicks, which sort of comes when you're trying to figure out your... Also try to stem the flow by putting Charlie Curnow down back as a spare man, at times once they were losing, which sort of raised a few eyebrows, considering this happened more after the Sydney run of goals in the second and third. And considering Carlton only kicked 2 goals in those quarters, people were sort of asking, isn't Curnow too important to move around, especially down back? And personally, I think the answer to that is yes when you look at some of the finer details. And I'm just going to take a second to go through a bit of that now, sort of going through Carlton's forward line. Carlton are missing some of their forward options in the short term, Cottrell and Fogarty being 2 of them, and in the long term, they're missing Stephen Silvani. However, a lot of their game style relies on the tall ball, with Curnow and Mackay being involved in 54% of their score involvements. Only Owies for their entire team averages over a goal a game besides those 2 at 1.5, which is crazy considering they have the 4th highest goals per game. And this includes the midfield unit, who also don't have a 1 goal a game scorer. All of them are about 0.5-ish. Got a forward line as good as Carlton, especially those 2 scorers. It's not necessarily the worst to be focused around them. But I think Sydney proved tonight that all you need to do is enough against Curnow and Mackay, which I'm really saying you don't need to put absolute clamps on them, but if you do enough to mitigate their influence, you shut down a lot of offensive capabilities for Carlton. The two players that they did that, Francis and Melican, did a solid job. And while they did score 2 goals too and 1 goals free, they didn't actually get involved in any scores that weren't their own direct shots, which is about half their usual output. Sydney also put the dual clamps on Carlton's midfield, proving that they are one of the biggest restricting teams in the competition. Cripps had to deal with the tackling tour de force of James Rowbottom, who restricted him to just 24 possessions at 41% efficiency, which is the real big one. And after a 7 goal disposal, 1 goal quarter at 71% efficiency, James Jordan would restrict Sam Walsh to only 13 more disposals for the night at 55% efficiency. And Pittonet actually had the highest disposal efficiency at Carlton, with 60% of all the midfield unit that attended more than 25% of the centre bounces, essentially just the inside midfield. I guess you could sort of draw parallels in this comeback from last week. Obviously, Melbourne almost were able to fully rally against Carlton, but just fell short. Um, but Sydney got back at them A lot early, and B just in a lot stronger, dominant performance than Melbourne did. Obviously, Melbourne relied a lot on Petrarca just having a field day, whereas this was just a real flick of the switch for the whole team for Sydney. For Carlton, they managed to find themselves out the 8, as I mentioned, and just as people were calling them premiership threats, they're now sort of saying that they'll miss the 8 from here, which I sort of find a bit premature. Because when you look at the context of the schedule, Carlton's actually had it pretty tough and has held up okay. There are only 2 teams in the current top 10 with a winning record against each other, which is Collingwood, Port Adelaide, and Sydney, with Carlton and Melbourne being the only 2 teams with an even record against each other. Um, so yeah, Carlton at least has made that 50-50, but they've also had the most games against the top 10 with 6. So they've had to prove themselves more often than some of the teams around them. Carlton also have the 2 interstate wins against Fremantle and Brisbane, who have played pretty well. And yeah, even though Brisbane aren't as high on that ladder, they were still pretty good in that round 1 game. Sydney, however, absolutely unbelievably better when you add the context for them. They have had 7 out of their 10 games against the current top 10 and 7 wins. Despite a few other contenders looking a bit flashier at times, the record over 10 weeks don't lie, and they deserve to be thought of as the team to beat currently and probably the team to beat in September. Me and Blaze have sort of thrown a few names into the hat for teams that are like the best at the moment. We've said GWS. I sort of flirted with Geelong for a bit. But honestly, despite Sydney having like a minor hiccup with the Richmond performance, they've really not had too many times where they looked like they were really, really gonna lose against any team, or even just a game where they weren't absolutely able to do what they want. And at this point of the year, it is scary. Obviously, sometimes as the years go on, plans get a bit more focused for each team, especially in finals. Teams might find a way to counter this, but at the same time, they're really going to counter this because, you know, I don't think any team wants to face Sydney currently, and I think it will stay that way for quite a while yet. All right, we head to the MCG now. What was a beautiful day of Saturday football. It would open up with a treat as Collingwood faced Kawana, also the Adelaide Football Club, and were almost inseparable in both statistical and direct scoring. Disparity wasn't on display for the entire match, as Collingwood got out to an early lead and was looking quite ominous with a 30-point margin at about somewhere in the second, with Scott Pendlebury and Nick Dacos being both class and contested respectively, whilst Josh Dacos, their little brother, also lit it up quite a bit. Guana would work their way back into the contest in the second quarter, with both good set shot kicking and getting back on track with the clearances, led also by a solid second quarter efforts by Dawson and Isaac Rankin. Jordan DeGoey and Chris feasted in the third quarter, and turnovers would amount to 5 of their 7 turnover goals for the match. And in a crazy turn of events, after only scoring 1 goals 2 from stoppage all day, Quana would go on to kick 3 goals 1 from them in the last quarter, including a miracle snap from the pocket from Isaac Rankin that would put the Crows in front. While he was excellent in the stoppage, Nick Dacos did show that his footwork may need a little work, as he blazed a shot out in the full that would have at least tied or put the Magpies in front. But a freak pressure turnover was the thing that separated the team. It led to a fast chain of movement with almost all of Collingwood's best players for the night, including Moore, Dacos, Crisp, and DeGoey, who finish it up in front of goal, kicking the winner, putting Collingwood in front with only a small bit left to play in the game. Rankin tried to create another stoppage goal with a beautiful aggressive run from halfback, beating it inside 50. However, after a bounce, he ran 24 odd metres from 14 steps and was called for running too far. The game was over at that point. 12-6, 78 for Collingwood, 11-8, 74 for Quana. Both teams had players who contributed despite not having huge stats. This game was highlighted by some really top-level players creating some huge moments in the game. Nick Dacos, who we said before, broke some of his personal bests with 22 contested possessions and 14 clearances to go with his massive 40 disposals, 13 hardball gets, 32 pressure acts, and 7 score involvements. Depending on how much you rate disposal efficiencies and hate clangers, you might actually not give him the best on ground, however. You might give it to Pendlebury or Rankin and not raise too many eyebrows. With Pendles getting 30 possessions, 12 contested, 6 clearances, 11 ground ball gets, 8 score involvements, 21 pressure acts, and 2 straight goals. And Rankin for Quana getting 30 possessions, 16 contested, 8 clearances, 10 ground ball gets, 4 tackles, 20 pressure acts, 4 intercepts, and a goal. Moore and Maynard down back racked up interceptions as well, with 21 together, and Darcy restricting Tex. Big Stack Billy kept Fogarty to a donut in the first and was pretty restrictive down back, leading the ball counts with 8, whilst Lachlan Murphy and Rochelle up forward was putting a lot of pressure up for Quana when they did get it to ground, with Rochelle having 5 tackles inside 50 and 2 goals too from a quiet 13 disposals, and Murphy having 8 score involvements with 3 direct goal assists, 20 pressure acts, 2 tackles inside 50, and a nice Joe the Goose in the last quarter. Jordan Butts was paired on Mason Cox and made sure he was only damaging in the ruck position, and also it sort of made me laugh at the Butts Cox matchup. And Hinge blew the doors open to the game with 26 disposals at a massive 96% efficiency, 7 intercepts, 4 score involvements, and a goal. Both Cameron and O'Brien in the ruck were very good in waves, ebbing and flowing in domination and getting their own clearances with neither infringing, but Cameron around the ground had 3 intercept marks, 4 inside 50s, and over double O'Brien's metres gained, which sort of made his game stand out a bit more. Honestly, there's not that much more to say about the game itself, which was great, but it was a very simple contest. Consistency might be what both teams try and get out of this, as there were waves of constriction and flooding in the types of scoring that were going on during the game, but arguably that was just the tone of the game. Basically, whoever had possession sort of set up the way that we're trying to score for the quarter, and, Adelaide, Quana try to respond at times, Collingwood try to respond at times. They were both successful in parts and lacking in the others. The other thing for Quana, obviously, was the conversion from their periods of dominance was quite low, especially in the early second and the full last quarter. and both teams had to rely a lot on midfield generating scores. Although the Pies will be happy that youngsters Reef McInnes and Joe Richards got 3 goals, with Richards also playing a lot of forward pressure. McInnes, unfortunately, was benched at halftime with a concussion that he got from Keane, who kept him possessionless in the first, so it was a mixed day for him all round. And Will Hoskin Elliott was also subbed off with a hamstring injury, and that will keep him out for a few. Kiwana will need to win very soon. Um, they've got a run of early games, and despite looking really solid over this last few weeks, they've been T2-1, and they've had an 80 plus point differential in that time. So a couple of small losses, a big win, and a draw. They've got some good scores against good teams. So percentage needs to be on the cards as they face a few of the bottom four sides coming up. Yeah, in order to compete, the slower teams competing for finals, because yeah, they're just a bit on the back foot. They're sitting, I think it was 14th with a low 100-ish percentage. Meanwhile, Collingwood just sit outside the top four, and they have not lost this year as the home team. They've still lost at the G, but when they're in the home slot, they seem to be doing well. So some huge gains in the back half at the G, and it's all up to them to determine their fate, to prove whether the start of the year was just teething issues or whether they've still got a bit to work on with, especially in the forward line, where they could, yeah, use a few more goals. I guess that about wraps it up for that game. I feel like, considering how good the game was, I probably could have put a few more statistics or whatever, but honestly, I think it was just one of those things where it was very deceptive because, everything happened in waves. So despite the statistics, or general statistics at the very least being very similar, yeah, it was just waves of dominance, and Collingwood were just a fraction more efficient. Nothing really separates the team. Again, unfortunately, Isaac Rankin, to put insult to injury, unfortunately, as you probably heard by now, has injured his hamstring. He'll miss a few weeks from that. Yeah, and as I said, it was a bit unfortunate for Adelaide because I think most people viewed Rankin running too far. Saw it was only 14 steps and was like, man, the umpires made a massive error here. You don't normally see those called. How can you do that in a, you know, big final moment like that? But, as I said, umpires, they generally know what they're doing despite moments. Um, and yeah, as I said, it made me feel a bit silly when I saw it was 24 meters, and I think that, as I said, huge takeaway from that is how long is Isaac Rankin's stride? Like, I swear, I'd be struggling to get the meter per step that they normally rank that on, and he's just blitzing past that for a man that's not that tall. So hopefully he recovers. I'd love to see him back. It's going to be a huge blow for them. He's been generating so much out of the midfield. I think it's a part of why they've been gelling together is that they've preferred that sort of composition. Obviously, Rochelle's moved a bit more up forward. Saligo, again, is sort of that, pairing for him. So, yeah, I think Rochelle will be back to the midfield, and hopefully it won't cause them too much loss, but we'll see. And yeah, so to we're going to skip the Saturday night games. I'll cover them in the wrap up, because yeah, they weren't as exciting. A game that was exciting, however, involving my club, my colours, Yartapuulti versus Hawthorn. They will have a busy review sessions on Monday. This week, as both clubs will try and figure out exactly what went wrong in both the first and last quarters for their teams, respectively. Yartapuulti had a very weird mindset in the first quarter. I think, well, there was threats of rain for the entire day. It only came down on the third, but I swear Yartapuulti just thought they were a bit too much in wet weather mode. Maybe they were too focused on the territory and trying to gain that. Or the freak loss of Ollie Wines early. He had heart palpitations. He should be fine. I'll talk a bit more about that later. But maybe that did disrupt them. But whatever it was, they were absolutely getting smashed in the contest. They lost centre bounces. They weren't willing to get that hard ball gets and often running over the ball trying to get ineffective ground kicks. And it led to a lot of defensive errors. There was a few slips by some of the tolls, although he had a good game. Asava Radagalia had one that conceded a goal. Um, yeah, meanwhile, um, it wasn't a problem for Hawthorn, who came in with a much smaller forward line, where Yartapuulti looked too tall at times. They were playing Ola Vicentini, Dixon, Marshall, Finlayson, and Mitch Georgiades. The latter two did not have much impact in the game at all, especially Georgie, who I think played a role that I can only describe as the floating nothing, as he appeared more down back and on the wing. I thought he looked a bit sore, but nothing came up on the injury report, and it was just, yeah, unfortunately, I don't like to highlight bad performances, but when you're going into a possibly wet game, that really stuck out to me. When you're sort of running that big lineup and down the other end, Blake Hardwick kicks four as a small forward, despite being on Alia. You just feel like you've missed a V and it's all going to go to hell in a handbasket quickly. Yartapuulti would settle down, but they only gained 3 points of their 31-point opening margin, back by the 22 mark of the third quarter. A Cam McDonald goal would give them a 41-point lead at Adelaide Oval. 5-7, 37 to Yartapuulti to 12-6, 78 to Hawthorn. They looked done, like the game looked over. At that time, Jungkook Jiath, who came back from injury, was rested, subbed off for Luke Bruce, and Hawthorn would make the bold move of putting Blake Hardwick, who now had 5 goals, back in defence. And Hawthorn started to creep into a more defensive, tentative game, and it just sort of looked like they were trying to hold on to the lead, partially because Yartapuulti was lifting, being led by Houston and Horn Francis, whilst youngsters Vicentini and Mead also impressed in that time. 3 more Yartapuulti players in the fourth quarter would really lift. Butters, 17 disposals, 7 contested possessions, 5 clearances, and 5 inside 50s in the last quarter alone doubled his possession count. Willie Rioli kicked 2 goals in the comeback portion of the game, one of which he had to do with time running down on the clock. He had to kick it so quickly, left about 34 seconds, I want to say, on the clock after taking it about 50. So brilliant job from him, smart play. Darcy Byrne-Jones, though, was the one who won it for Port, and in a blitz of a last quarter with about I think it was 5 seconds left on the clock, socket it through for a goal from a clearance out the middle, putting Port in front. They would be in front for the entire game, less than a minute. They would win the quarter 30 points to 1, the last quarter. And despite Yartapuulti going goalless until the 11th minute into the last quarter, um, Hawthorn did leave too many attacking options open. They lost the inside 50 count, 22 to 4, just short of double what Yartapuulti had up to that point in the game. And unfortunately, sent home packing in a game that they should have won. Yeah, so going through Hawthorn's early dominance, because I do want to go through this. I haven't talked about Hawthorn much in depth this year, so I want to highlight some of the good things. And what was clear to me, as well, in that match, was they were winning nearly every major matchup around the ground and exposing Yartapuulti once they had hands on the ball. We've talked about Hardwick. But Chol's speed early on was a threat up forward. He made Port's defenders very uncomfortable, scored 2 goals, and all 3 of his tackles for the night were inside 50, which I found cool. Cam McKenzie, He had a very versatile day, both up the ground and in the midfield, and he scored 2 goals, got 12 disposals, 10 contested, 4 clearances, and 4 score involvements. Connor McDonald also provided a lot of pressure with 4 tackles inside 50 out of 8 total tackles for the night. Kaushi Adia, the youngster for Hawthorn, he kicked a goal. He looked very threatening in the first half, but unfortunately he had a horrid day kicking in front of goals. I think he kicked 2 out in the full to go on with his behind, but in terms of hands, in terms of presenting up forward, that youngster has been very good. I really hope he can slaughter through because he's been really solid in his first couple of games. In the midfield, Will Day and Warple, who also roamed outside, were fantastic. They combined for 46 disposals, 23 contested at 70 and 89% kicking efficiency, respectively, 11 clearances, 8 score involvements, while Big Lloyd Meek provided absolute headaches for a very trying Vicentini and got 45 hitouts, 4 clearances, 12 contested possessions out of his 18 for the day. In the back line, debutant Ethan Phillips put Finlayson to absolute shame, restricting him to 3 behinds and a woeful 22% efficiency from his miserly 9 disposals, whilst he himself got 8 intercepts. He led intercepts marks with 3 for the day. He got 5 spoils, 5 1%ers, 10 possessions at 100% efficiency. In my mind, he was actually probably the rising star. It will go to a player who we'll mention later. But yeah, I think that was quite a great performance by the newbie. Sam Frost, who was with him in the backline, had very similar stats. Was a bit less clean, but he absolutely shut down Charlie Dixon down forward. And Charlie Dixon's major impact was in the pinch ruck. Got a few clearances. His big body. He's the roll dicer. He's the dice roller with in King Tinkley. It's always scary to see him in the ruck. His body is a bit fragile, but he can generate some very good forward clearances for his tap work. And finally, in terms of players, former Yartapuulti player Carl Amon and former Essendon player D'Ambrosio killed it off halfback with 9 interceptions, about 1,900 metres gained, 55 disposals, and 8 inside 50s. In terms of Yartapuulti's players, Horn Francis was the clear 4-quarter performers with 27 possessions, 15 contested, 6 clearances, 4 tackles, 10 score involvements, and 2-1 for the day. No doubt in my mind, the best player for Yartapuulti and probably the day. Assisting him in the mids were actually a couple of pinch-on bowlers. Jackson Mead, who I mentioned earlier, continuing his form. He had a great game last game, great game this game, 18 possessions, 10 contested, 5 intercepts, 5 inside 50s, 4 tackles, and 4 score involvements. And Boak, the veteran, probably lifted as the game went on with 26 possessions, 9 contested, 7 marks, 5 tackles, 22 pressure acts, and 9 score assists. Willem Drew was a fantastic pressure applier again with 10 tackles. He had 18 possessions and 8 score involvements. Kane Farrell, he got 26 possession and 8 contested with 5 score involvements, 5 intercepts, and was very good off halfbacks when the Yartapuulti Tolls were struggling, as well as late with Houston, who launched 3 goals, 2 from outside 50, laid 10 tackles, took 8 marks, 2 intercept marks, and had 5 score involvements. And pretty much, if we didn't have Houston and Horn Francis, we would have been nowhere near the game. He really started the momentum shift. Asava and Aaliyah took 12 intercept marks and 6 spoils together. And despite some really good moments, they really looked shaky in the slippery conditions, with Aaliyah also conceding 3 free kicks, and 2 of those led to goals. Yeah, a lot can be said about the territory loss in the 4th quarter for the Hawks, and some of the decisions to, move players around, put them back. But their defense actually held up as Yartapuulti had no set shots from inside 30 for the entire day. However, when they were dominating, not a lot of transition came from their back half, with only four scoring shots, oh, goals, mind you, coming from their back half, and a lot were just short chains, not a lot of movements, compared to the plentiful scoring chains past centre field from Yartapuulti, which means once they had control of the ball, um, they were able to move it better. And on the flip side, when the ball was sort of locked in the forward half of the Hawks, they weren't really at their best, which sort of led to the insane comeback. Once the ball was locked in Hawthorn's back half, they really, really struggled, which was unfortunate. It was almost the opposite for Hawthorn, who were very restrictive up forward, but couldn't handle the fast pace ball movement from Yartapuulti from the back half, which I mentioned before, which Hawthorn are normally good at. So in essence, yeah, they had a good team right where they wanted him in terms of Yartapuulti for 3 quarters, and they just got caught in their shells, when the pressure was on. They were good in their positioning, but they just couldn't get that ball movement and, find their way to the goal, like in the opening bits of the fourth quarter, that would have just give them a bit of confidence, like although it was very good them defending for that 11 minutes, keeping Port scoreless, it just meant that they were holding off rather than taking the win, taking that momentum back. And, it's a bit of a shame. Sam Mitchell in his presser said that it wasn't a directive to hold the ball up and that they should hopefully learn from this. And, the Hawks brand of football that I was sort of wondering what it was at the start of the year is still starting to show. They're a tempo controlling team. They'll try and restrict your ball movement by winning the ball hard. They'll work for it, but when they do work for it and get it, they'll do a few calculated kicks, try and get those uncontested marks, and control the pace from there. As for Yartapuulti, it's quite simple. They got bailed out by high-end talent in this game, and although a win's a win and far better than a loss, yeah, the optics of this game is very rough, as Yartapuulti were booted out of the 8 when they were losing by 5 points. And when they got to that 1 point win, they're now in the top 4, half a game clear of Collingwood. Yeah, like a few other teams, Yartapuulti are fantastic when they control possession. They're good at restricting what other teams want to do, but their wastefulness up forward and the looks that teams are able to then generate from halfback from either turnovers going inside 50 or, from the from kickouts, I should say. Um, they it tends to burn them, and they need to compete a lot harder when the bowl is there to be won. When in transition in the midfield, when they get the ball to ground, because they are good at restricting marks, and not just rely on the contested ball at stoppages. On the injury front, Wine seems to have cleared a protocol for his heart condition. He knows it well, so he should be fine. Touch wood, it's not confirmed he's back for next week, but they are pretty positive. However, poor Josh Sin, he missed some opportunities early in the year through injury and showed glimpses in this game. He played last week as well and was okay. He's out for 6 weeks with fractured collarbone in a very tough but very fair contest with the Warpedo. Yeah, I mean, look, I gotta go through some of the emotion. I was very drained for most of this match when the machinations in the head, because, as a Port supporter, you sort of know that we're enough on the pace where, I still think we're probably going to make finals. I'm say it with some degree of confidence. We don't look the best, but you just hope that maybe we get some form at the back end of the year. But, seeing Hawthorn control us so easily, it was very doomy in my head for that first few quarters. I did actually sense some of the comeback. I thought we fought very hard in the second, but I was just very impressed. There was times where I felt we could have got a bit more. during, both the second and the third quarters, but Hawthorn were just being, very good, just scoring enough. And, it's a real shame they couldn't continue that. Well, not for me in the last. But, as I said, despite, however, how much I was frustrated at some of the, coaching decisions, maybe, I guess, in team selections, and despite how much asterisks and whatever I can put on the win, ah, boy, it just felt good when the winning goal was kicked. So much relief, so much, enjoyment. And, you shout out, I gave a big Yartapuulti at the end of the game. And yeah, pretty much it's one of my favorite things about this port side is despite what you want to say about Hinkley, is they will never give up. He's got the belief instilled in them. It's more about executing game plans and probably having a bit more depth before the bounce. But honestly, despite whether he gets cut next year, I will absolutely be thankful for Hinkley and some of those, come from behind wins that he's been able to sort of generate from having such a cohesive playing group. And yeah, on the flip side, for Sam Mitchell for Hawthorn, it was very disappointing, but Hawthorn will learn from this. They're now playing a very competitive game. Their last I think 5 games have been pretty good. So yeah, we'll see where they go from here. But despite it being tough, you can take a bit of moral victory out of it. You always like to win those games. You always got to review so you can have more opportunities to win those games. Um, but you got to take the positives with such a young team, and instill that some of this game plan is really good, and some of this game plan, if we can get it going, can put us in positions to win. And finally, we now head to Optus Oval for probably one of the more surprising upsets. If the first game wasn't an upset for you, um, then this game would have certainly shocked you a bit. Woolwich Marawa, also the West Coast Eagles, inflicted the shock loss by brutalising Nam, the Melbourne Footy Club, as if they were fellow friends on the lower ladder. This match had several Marawa players impose themselves, and it might just be the first match that Harley Reid gets called best on ground, maybe even on Brownlow night, as he could not be tackled by some of the hardest nuts in footballer in Petrarca, Oliver, and Viney, and he set up some salivating centre bounce goals. Waterman kicked 5, Darling kicked 3, and Reid and Ryan kicked 2, as Marawa's offense looked much better than what was produced against Collingwood, and their defense was outstanding despite the 20 scoring shots, as almost all of their goal attempts by Nam were very close to the 50-metre arc or very, very wide. Nam was very unlucky early with Jake Lever going down. Hate to see it with concussion, which led May to be all lost at sea in Melbourne's defence, which we're not used to seeing him struggle as much, or even the Nam defence struggling through injury. The one thing that kept Waliat Malawa from planting the foot on the throat of Nam was the centre bounce defence, as Gorn gave a lot of opportunities with some good rup work to create avenues of easy ball movement, which kept the lead hovering from about 15 to 30 points all night, but a late run of goals secured the win. This is an emphatic home win by Wally at Marawa. They got 16-9, 105 to Nam's 10-10, 70. A lot was said when Harley Reid had a week off rest, but it's now clear what Simpson has in mind for the young kid. He's going to get looked after. He is going to get what he needs to be done for him so he can play as much midfield time as he possibly can. And he wants the kid to play the football he wants to play. All Simpson needs to do is manage his body for the season, make sure he doesn't get too overwhelmed by playing the centre bounce. But this game, he was rewarded with a lot of attendance in the centre. He attended 87% of centre bounce stoppages. The next task, interestingly enough, was fellow youngster Ruben Gibney. and he had 21 disposals at an insane 90% efficiency with 10 contested possessions, 7 clearances, 4 tackles, 2 goals, and 10 score involvements. That was obviously Harley Reid, not Ruben Gibney. It wasn't just him in the middle though. As the engine was on full motor with Kelly and Gibney, both playing great games. Kelly got 30 possessions, 8 clearances, 8 score involvements, 4 direct goal assists, and 34 pressure acts, while Gibney got 11 possessions, 6 clearances, 23 pressure acts, and a goal, and both cumulatively getting 21 ground ball gets. Oliver worked very hard for his 26 disposals for Nam. 20 of those were contested, generated 9 clearances, and had 8 tackles. But most of Nam's midfield just felt a bit subdued for the night, except Maley Salem, who was solid in his return after a stint of a sideline with injury. And Gorn, while he was good, as I said, in some of the ruck contests, it was against BJ Williams, and he definitely wasn't as damaging as he could have been around the ground. I think Williams ran with him quite well. Of this game was really interesting because it may have been where the biggest disparity between the two teams lay all night, and it wasn't anything you would expect them going in. Wally at Malawa, they looked to defend fantastically, but they rebounded so well again, with a lot more scoring shots coming from the back half and their ball moving looking much more excitement. McGovern led this. He had 6 intercept marks, doubled the best for the night. He had 23 disposals at 82% efficiency, 1,000 odd meters, 542 meters gained, and 9 intercepts, while Hoff and Duggan combined with 34 disposals, they had the 1,000 meters gained between the two of them and 18 marks. Barris kept Ben Brown struggling all night, limiting to a goal and 3 possessions. Kildum, Fritsch, and McAdams were dual solid forward options for Melbourne. 3 marks inside 50s each, 5 score involvements, with Fritsch scoring 3 and McAdams scoring 1-1. Probably could have had a few more, but overall he was very good on his first game for the Melbourne. On the other end, I mentioned the goals early, but Waterman also had 6 marks inside 50. He had 13 altogether. He had 8 score involvements, while Darling had an amazing tackling night. He had 12, a whopping 9 of those were inside 50. And he also had 7 score involvements with the goals I talked about earlier. 3, I think it was. Yeah, so despite the highish scoring and moderately lopsided stat count in favor of Wally at Malawa, Nam were able to apply pressure at parts. Both teams were actually fairly good in the pressure ratings. But yeah, as I said, Nam were just lost at sea defensively. There were elements in their style in this match, with that contested work out the middle, but they were really just shooting themselves in their foot with inaccuracy and turnovers. It just made life really hard for them. And probably the most damning thing for Nam for the entire night was probably the scores conceded from turnovers. They conceded a whopping 70 to 14. So not only did they concede a lot, they also really couldn't generate the intercepts. And Wally at Malawa, I would venture to say that this is probably the most impressive win of the year for them. I'll rate it over the Derby, as they managed to have pretty much a full 4-quarter game where they were playing at all points their game plan. They didn't play fade defensively, as they're known to do at times this year. And plus, they didn't have Yo, and they still managed to win the clearances quite convincingly against one of the tougher matchups you can have in football, in Nam, of course. And yeah, honestly, the scope has changed for them for now. They know where they are on the ladder. They're not gonna, run before they can walk. But I think one thing they do want to keep is Optus Stadium being a hard venue for teams to visit this year. They want to be that thorn in the side. They want to get that home crowd electric again, because it absolutely was when Harley Reid absolutely stormed the field, whether it was the fend offs, whether it was the goal. it was so exciting to see that crowd really light up. And, you know, honestly, it's no surprise. I tend to favor Freo fans in WA a tiny bit more. They've got more of that homeliness. They're less intense, but that intensity does make for some thrilling spectacles. And yeah, as I said, Ollie Reid, I mean, you're going to be sick of hearing him by the end of the year, and I'm not going to focus too much. It's not my style. I don't like focusing too much on one specific player. Obviously, teams are more than that. But what this guy is able to generate in such a short amount of time is absolutely fantastic. But honestly, it's not just that. It's just when you get that belief as a team, which again is not directly, I think a lot of it's what Simpson set up by being so strong to his convictions, and by making sure when they get to this point, they've got game plans to go back on. But just the overall belief in this team, I think it's caused a lot more of the younger players to stand up. Obviously, being able to pick and choose the inform younger players rather than picking from injuries is a huge thing. But yeah, West Coast, there's some positivities. Probably not going to tip them for next week, but we'll think about it the more home games they get. And they get quite a few at Optus near the end of the year. And yeah, that wraps it up for the long form analysis. I will go over the other games very quickly. GWS couldn't keep from getting in the way of themselves as they were turning the ball over to a Dogs team who at least kept their wastefulness in front of goal. They recorded 8:22 for the night. It was a bit comical. Only two players for the Giants registered goals, though. Green, Tobias, and Hogan, who got three each, while players like Himmelberg, Haynes, and Whitfield were good at starting chains from the back half. Hims especially going at 83% efficiency from his 30 possessions and 10 marks, but they tended to dissipate as they went up the ground, and that did not change the closer the ball movement was to the goal face. Anything forward of the 50, the chains were short. It just really wasn't quite good enough for how talented the pieces they got there. Despite a solid tagging job on the bont by Ward, the dog would dominate the clearances as well, with Ed Richards not taking Libba's spot in the middle for granted, with 10 clearances, 12 contested possessions from 27, and Treloar registering more contested possessions at 23 than all but one Giants midfielder's got in total possessions for the entire game. So Treloar was an absolute contested beast this week. Harms turned into a bit of a gadget man, playing all around the field as he drifted a bit more forward this week and kicked 2 goals too. Now for Richmond, they could not find the way to get their hands on the ball with their absolutely depleted squad at the moment, as Brisbane just sunk their claws into them. Kyle Lohmann, the winner of this week's Rising Star Award, congratulations to him. I know I said I wanted the other player to get it earlier, but he absolutely deserved it still. He's transitioned into a more forward role this week. He sort of played off halfback. As I said, he was sort of the Kitty Coleman replacement, but now has sort of gone aggressive, kicked 5. Neil and Dunkley were fantastic in the centre, and although Richmond won the clearances, there were a lot of handballs and a lot of turnovers, which Brisbane scored a massive 111 points off of. They registered also almost 2,000 more metres with their possessions, and their scores were roughly equal coming from the back half of the ground as it was from the forward half of the ground. So this was just an all around the ground dominance from them. Um, they registered a whopping 19 shots from less than 30 metres out, and 27 set shots from 20 marks inside 50. It was a defensive dismantling for Richmond. Obviously, doesn't mean all that much for them because they just don't have any players at the moment. The benefit for the Brisbane is they get a lot of percentage back, and it's a huge boost for their finals chances. But there's really not much to say about it. It's just unfortunately a bit sad for the Tigers, and hopefully once Blazy comes back, they might get a few players back, and they'll next week is the round draft. So they will get a few players as well. So I look forward to that. Okay. Uric versus Walliup at the Optus Stadium, Saints versus Fremantle. It was technically close for much of the game. For the most part, Uric just look familiarly anemic, with not much ball movement coming from their back half and being unable to kick scores the few times they did lock it into their forward half. Their best form of attack came from clearances, which they scored the same as Walliup from, despite losing the clearance count 17. So if they did win the ball out the middle, they might have been able to score a bit more because they really didn't look like scoring from anywhere else. It was really a bit of a shame. Meanwhile, on the flip side, Wally Up should have kicked a bit more, considering they had 18 set shots. Jai Amos kicked 2 goals 5, and Patrick Voss kicked 1 goals 3. I think they kicked 9 goals 18 for the night. And yeah, as I said, it was just a bit of a butchering up forward, but presentation very good. Hopefully, Pat Voss can keep his spot because I do think he's presenting well, but a bit like Kalshi Adia for Hawthorn, he's just been very inaccurate. The midfield, the standout for Walliup, Sarong, Young, Jackson, Brayshaw, they were all fantastic. Pierce and Ryan were also very great down back. You'd expect it, but they were there. And honestly, apart from Ryan Marshall, it was very hard to see many impactful performances from Uric, as unfortunately Uric were just very unimpactful. They converted well. That's about it. Their chains were putrid, and yeah, they really struggled to win the ball. Hopefully, they'll find a way to bring it back because it is affecting them. Like, they're a great defensive team, but they're sort of losing it just by the sheer volume. And if they can start by patching it up in the middle, I know their forward line's a mess, but I don't think that's going to be fixed this season. I think the middle of the ground can. I think transition can. They need to generate something from there. They've got a few fast players. They might be able to do something, and hopefully in the next few weeks we'll see something a bit different because it's just not that great for St Kilda. Yeah, I won't rag on them too much more. Essendon, they got a much needed win against the Roos. The Roos did look a lot better effort wise. They were much more on the pace this week than their last few games where they were pretty woeful. And they actually restricted a very good disposal team and a very good clearance team to just 28 clearances to their 42. But unfortunately, North just struggled to do much with them. Essendon had a much easier time converting their forward half possessions, whether from clearances or turnovers, into goals. As expected with these two defenses, the score of halfback were pretty big, but one glaring issue for North is they just couldn't win the ball in general play, and they massively lost the territory battle. So yeah, they could win the ball, they just weren't moving it all too all too well. But you know, they just weren't flying players ahead and weren't capitalizing in that. On a bright note, Core held the top 5 kicking goal kicker, in Langford to just a goal. Again, a really good match considering he's been up and down. And Charlie Comben held his own against Stringer despite his couple of goals. But again, he's turning to be a cornerstone piece in defence. He's the next generation you're going to build around in that back line. LDU and Cherry, they were huge in the middle for North as well. Guelphy and Peter Wright kicked 3 goals free and 4 goals 2 respectively. Andrew McGrath and Heppel were great great in their ball movement. I think Heppel had insane, like 96% efficiency or something. And Mackay and Kelly kept the dual threats of Larky and Zeha quiet for most of the game. I think they kicked a goal each. And yeah, in terms of injury, Sam Durham was benched due to a neck complaint. I think that was a tiny bit management preventative, so I'm not sure if he's going to be out. But Melon Bergman for the Roos, he did a hamstring in the third quarter. Don't think he's going to play next week or maybe a few afterwards. And yeah, as I said, a bit of solid effort, but again, and I'll keep on saying it every week, North still conceded over 100 points. That is the first thing that they're going to try and have to fix. There's going to be a win somewhere along the line, but if they can get that minor victory, or either first or with a win, that's going to be something. Hopefully, that can give them a bit of forward momentum. Because, yeah, as I said, it's a bit dire. Well, defensively at least, midfield very good. Well, that week anyway. All right. We'll go through the games this week. I'll give you some of my thoughts on them. Starting with the Bulldogs in Sydney, this is going to be very interesting. Mainly because the Bulldogs are statistically one of the better teams that aren't performing. They really get their hands on the ball. They can do what they want. They're just very bad at converting. Their defense leaves a bit to be desired. But honestly, the way Sydney have been going, the way that they've been getting goals out their midfield, if the Bulldogs can get that pressure and nullify them a bit, it might make the game a bit more even. Um, yeah, I don't think some of the restrictive tactics that Sydney have been very good at doing will apply as much to the Bulldogs. Really, it will be how the midfield unit cope, how they get those clearances forward, whether they're good possessions or whether they're just turnovers. Because if they're turnovers, Sydney will just do what they've been doing with every team, sending the ball back with interest, converting, very fast play, and they'll win that. Honestly, I reckon this is I'm going to say it's like a 60-40 to um, Sydney. But honestly, it might be closer to 50-50. I'm going to tip the Swans. I'm very looking forward to that match. And if the Bulldogs can pull an upset, they'll be back into the mix. I hope for their season, because they can be very exciting. Despite being up and down, they can do it. Okay, Wally up versus Collingwood at Optus Stadium. Um, Again, it's gonna be interesting in terms of the fact that Collingwood, they've still not established that forward line, and they're up against one of the best defenses in the lead in Wally up. That's Fremantle, of course. Um, and yeah, as I said, two ball midfields. They love winning the ball in clearances. They love scoring from that part of the ground. Um, so again, that's maybe how both team pierces. Fremantle do like that central marking option, so it'll be interesting to see if they can get the ball in before someone like Darcy Moore is able to set up. It'll be interesting to see whether they stick very closely to Amos and Treacy, or whether they sort of, have one person on one and have the other that roaming interceptor. And yeah, honestly, again, going to be a pretty close game. I'm going to take Collingwood. I got a sneaky suspicion that Wally Up will win. I honestly, it's so dirty picking the two away teams because I do think that it's underrating the good that both of them, Bulldogs and Fremantle, can do. But yeah, as I said, feel free to vary that tip if you're fancying Wally up. Carlton versus the Gold Coast. Yeah, I think Carlton should probably win this. Again, their defense had trouble against Sydney. They look very exposed. The Gold Coast obviously looked very good against Geelong, but this is going to be a bit tougher. Gold Coast defense isn't that great. It's serviceable. The more damaging about it is moving of halfback, and if their midfield unit can work, they can expose Carlton's lack of transition. But in terms of that, they're a bit two-way. Like Gold Coast more their midfield's offensive base. Even though Rao's a tackling machine and good defensively, Carlton should have periods where they're on top of it. Hopefully, it'll get them a win for them. But yeah, as I said, while I'm more leaning towards Carlton, Gold Coast also do struggle away this year. Again, should hopefully be a contest. North and Port Adelaide, or Walliup. That is going to be played in Tasmania. It's at Hobart, I think. Um, and honestly, it's gonna Well, the test is, can North utilise these tough conditions to restrict, at the very least, Port Adelaide? They, at glimpses, were able to in TIA Stadium, though it didn't help them overall. When they play the Gold Coast, obviously. And Port Adelaide, they're just really wanting to show a four-quarter performance after two lapses at different parts of the game the last 2 weeks. They want to give their fans some certainty, but they also just want to get a bit of form while players are coming back, steady the ship, even though it's not really tipping, but you know what I mean. In terms of eye form, they're not being super, super great. And yeah, you would expect Port to win quite comfortably. This year, volume of entries will be hard for North Melbourne to defend. Geelong versus GWS, two teams really wanting to get back on it. It's at Cardinia Park, Goomba Stadium, and yeah, it's sort of hard to see GWS winning this. Like, especially after such a dire performance at home. And also it's a lot harder to move the ball at GHMBO Stadium. Um, so really, it's going to be up to their midfield core. As for Geelong, they want their players back desperately, as many forward players back as possibly can, because they were still good against, scoring 100 in those conditions. It's sort of at a bit of a caveat, and they want that, consistency there. Um, and yeah, honestly, yeah, I would pretty safely say Geelong. It will be interesting to see if GWS can get back into a bit of form, especially in their defense. They allowed so many scoring shots. They were just leaking. So if they can tighten that up, make it a bit of contest for them, and who knows, maybe Geelong can have a few more losses at GHMBA Stadium than one would predict at the start of the year. Yeah, Richmond versus Essendon, dream time at the G. Massive game in terms of the spectacle. If you're in Melbourne, go down and see it. Even, if you're a Richmond supporter, you're not feeling the team this year. As I said, it's one of the calendar games, and hopefully Richmond apparently get a few players back from selection. I don't think they're quite at 26, which they were at one point. 26 players available out of 23 that you pick for each match. So fingers crossed. Um, yeah, as I said, they can at least bring the effort. They showed it earlier in the year when they were sort of, you know, competing against teams. Um, and yeah, also I think I think they're very hard at the ball with their midfield core. They cause a lot of turnovers. So while Essendon do get a lot of the ball from the midfield, they're still turn the ball reasonably high. I'm not going to say it's like a huge problem for them, but it's just part of the core. So maybe Richmond can get some turnovers, compete a bit that way. But yeah, I just really want to see something positive, especially for Blazy when he comes back. So fingers crossed for him. Um, Now Hawthorn and Brisbane. I got to check this quickly. Where is this being played? It's being played at Marvel. Okay, so that changes things a bit. I was going to say, if this was another Tassie game, like maybe I could see Hawthorn winning, going, I was going to say, um, you know, but yeah, as I said, it's just the effort, especially against Brisbane. They can get so bully ball out of the middle. They've been able to do that a bit in the last few games this year. Um, so yeah, they may be able to cause a bit of dominance, but I just want to see some aggression. Brisbane defense is a bit vulnerable at times, so if Hawthorn can continue that aggressive ball movement, some fast pace, you can take those uncontested marks, but with that, just have control of the game, but also some direct attack. And yeah, I still tip Brisbane. Melbourne and St Kilda. Look, I'm not going to go too far in because I really think, sorry, Nam and Yura Yurik. Um, yeah, as I said, uh, honestly, I really need to see something out of St Kilda before I'm ever going to tip them in anything. Hopefully, Melbourne's shaky defense might give them a bit of a gleam. Um, but yeah, I don't really see much of it. Melbourne, especially if they look to be more contested, to patch up a bit of, the sort of embarrassment from West Coast. Um, yeah, just yeah, Melbourne, um, lock 'em in. Quana and Yalit Mar Yadich Marawa. Oh, sorry, I've completely lost it. It's not in front of me, unfortunately. It's the hardest one I've had to pronounce. Um, so yeah, Adelaide and West Coast. I think Adelaide's gonna. I think Woolwich Marawa away from home really going to struggle with this matchup. Adelaide's defense has been deceptively good, so it'll be really interesting to see if they can keep Waterman under. And especially because they have the three tolls, a lot is said about Waterman and you know Darling obviously had a good game, but Ramarich is at least presenting. So at least structurally, they're going to be have to be very honest. Um, at the midfield is going to be very interesting. I think both teams are more likely just going to be like, okay, we'll have periods where you're going to get the ball out the middle, but we're just going to try and outscore you, outmuscle you. I think Adelaide will win um, in that contest, and especially since their forwards are looking a bit more dangerously. But as I said, Isaac Rankin, a huge out. They're really going to hope that their midfield doesn't dip with this because he has been fantastic in the period where Adelaide's been looking very good, or Quana, I should say. And yeah, as I said, you know, they do have other players. Matt Crouch is playing fairly well. As I said, John Dawson, he hasn't been 100% consistent, but he's been very solid. I think Rory Laird is actually the person that really needs to lift for Adelaide, but I still bank on it happening. So Kwana, give him, I won't give him a huge amount, maybe like a late lead of like 20 points, and they should win that match. Alrighty then. I think we'll wrap it up here. It's been a bit of a long one. It took me quite a while to make these notes, and I hope they've been very informative. I hope this solo stuff has been all right for you. I must admit, I apologize for any artifacts in the first bit of the recording. Unfortunately, I just could not get going in terms of some of the takes, so you have to forgive me there. But honestly, if you've made it through, if you've just listened to your team or skipped around a bit, thank you so much because, I have put a lot of effort. I am proud that I've been able to get the podcast going for 2 weeks. But we will be back hopefully for our regular scheduled program next week. So even if Blazy doesn't do much coverage, I'll write the notes for him. We'll have a bit of a talk, we'll have a bit of a conversation, and we look forward to seeing you for the second part of Sir Doug Nicholls' round. Um, so yeah, also, check out the socials. Again, the links to the stats pages will be at the bottom. If you find them useful, check them out. Give them some love because, as I said, I love people that put different statistical analysis out there, not just the media pundits. So you can sort of make your own mind about the game. That's what I love doing. And I hope I can sort of, share some of my analysis. Hopefully it's a bit different to you guys. And yeah, so yeah, check out the socials. A lot of love to you all. Hope you had a great Mother's Day, however you choose to celebrate it, whether you're remembering someone, whether you're, you know, um, celebrating with someone. I hope that was a fantastic day for you this Sunday. And yeah, have a good one, and we look forward to seeing you next week.